And by the way, just interrupt me along the way. Now that I'm sharing the screen, I can't see all your faces. So if you want to unmute and say, hey, let's talk about that a little further, feel free to do that. You can either direct message Kelsey and she can interrupt me if you don't want to do it. But yeah, this time's for y'all. So we'll see what's going on. So what we have here, right, is a few weeks ago, I came and helped with the Philippians class and asked a question that kind of got John Paul and Kelsey asking further questions. And so I pulled them into a kind of an intensive that the Chalmers Center was running. And they created this little diagram on a whiteboard, started sending me pictures like this saying, you know, I think we're beginning to understand these things. Would you help explain it further? And I said, well, I can't even read what's going on this whiteboard, but maybe I can help lay some of the foundational theology that got you to this place. So the question that I asked in the Philippians study is, what is the good life, right? And maybe a follow-up question to that was, how is the good life achieved, right? So what is the good life and how is the good life achieved? And if you want to understand this, right? If you want to understand what the good life is, you must learn about God's design of you and his plan for the world. And so most people operate on this vision, right? Ever since the Enlightenment and in the West, right, in Europe and America, we've tended to believe that we are merely bodies, right? Physical beings. And but as Christians, we know there's a little bit more to it than that, right? That we're these embodied souls. And theologians have tried to help us understand what the soul is, and they've divided it into three parts, right? So the soul is made up of the mind, right? Our thought processes, our affections, right? What's going on inside our hearts, and our wills, right? Our dispositions to act, right? Like what's actually in our guts that makes us act. But here's the deal. What happens to us emotionally affects our bodies, right? And so we've all experienced this, right? You get in a fight with a roommate or a friend and you feel it in your gut, right, for the rest of the day. Maybe as you leave the apartment or the house or whatever, right? You sort of feel it and you're like, but that was a cognitive fight. Why is it messing with my body? What's going on here? And the reality is we're just highly integrated beings. And so it looks a little bit more like this, right? These highly integrated mind, affection, will, embodied things. But that's actually not all of it, right? There's more to it than that. We're actually, as these highly integrated beings, we're designed to be in relationships. Remember, we're made in the image of a triune God. So before creation, before anything happened, right, God has eternally existed in three persons, right? So he's a relational God. In fact, one theologian in the 2nd century said this: the being is the relationship, and the relationship is the being. Right? In other words, we can't think of God outside of him existing in a relationship of persons. Right? And so when we think of ourselves as creatures made in the image of God, right? We are these mind, affection, will, body things that are designed to be in relationships. And let me explain this, because C.S. Lewis illustrates this really well in his book, The Four Loves. In each of my friends, there is something that only some other friend can fully bring out. By myself, I am not large enough to call the whole man into activity. I want other lights than my own to show all his facets. Now that Charles is dead, so that's Charles Williams. Remember, C.S. Lewis had this small group of friends called the Inklings that he hung out with. Charles Williams was one of the older ones. Tolkien and Lewis were buddies as well. Now that Charles is dead, I shall never again see Ronald. Now that's Tolkien's reaction to a specifically Charles joke. Far from having more of Ronald, having him to myself, now that Charles is away, I have less of him. Right? See, he has less of him because we're designed to be in relationship. And so when a relationship is taken away, actually part of that human being you're interacting with has been taken away. Right? And when we start thinking like this, the theologians have described it as that there are these 4 key relationships, right? A relationship with God. And you see this in the Garden of Eden. The easiest way to describe it is in the Garden of Eden when sin enters, right? They hide from God. Broken relationship. They're ashamed and cover their nakedness. Broken relationship with self. They start accusing one another on whose sin it was. Broken relationship with others. And then God's curse, right, comes with the pain of childbirth and the challenge of weeds and thistles and thorns in the ground, right? A broken relationship with creation. And so as these highly integrated mind, affection, will, body relational beings, when I ask the question, right, what is the good life? It's really saying, like, what's the story? What's the narrative behind your existence in this world? And so you can start illustrating it like this, right? So what is valued here? What does success look like for this individual person? What is the good life? But then from this story, what we do is we build institutions, formal and informal institutions that get systematized, right? And they create these systems that actually express what that story is. Now, because John Paul is on this call, we'll just, and you know, he's the one in charge. Let's take the system of basketball, right? So the story of change in basketball is to score more points than the other team, right? And then there's a system built around this story of change, right? You know, to score points, right, you have to put the ball in the basket. And there's a line that if you're standing behind it, you get more points than if you're standing in front of it. And you can't do things like goaltend or foul or whatever else. So there's this system that's built up around the story to kind of formalize the story in people's hearts and minds. And then that system enters into us by practices. So in fact, if you want to be good at basketball, right, you practice dribbling and passing and shooting and playing defense and all these sorts of things that make you the kind of person who would be successful in that story. Right now, here's the deal. We never, well, very rarely do we actually get to build this from the ground up. So most of the time, we're just dropped smack in the middle of an already existing system, right? And it's shaping us by calling us into practices and that we may or may not realize we have consciously sometimes, but often unconsciously, just started engaging in the world around us. And this becomes a process that we might call, that the Chalmers Center calls the process of human formation, the process of formation. This is how we are shaped in this world, right? So super challenging. So I guess at this point, can I ask, like, are there hands being raised? Anybody want to ask questions about that before we move on? Okay, seeing none from Kelsey. She's the only face I can see right now. We'll move on. So let me illustrate this. One of my favorite illustrations of this came during World War II. So this is Winston Churchill, and a quote that he came up with. He said, "We shape our buildings, and afterwards our buildings shape us." And let me explain this. So he's a politician, and after the Commons Chamber was bombed during World War II, the group, right, agreed to retain rebuilding the chamber in a square shape, as opposed to building it in more of like a horseshoe or even a round shape. And Churchill's argument for this was that the square shape created adversarial conversations between two parties, right, where they're actually looking at each other across a hall, as opposed to a horseshoe shape, which would sort of change the nature of their democracy, right? So instead of two people fighting for a common, for maybe a common solution, once you shift to a horseshoe, it changes the way that we interact. And so Churchill's sort of final line in this speech was, we shape our buildings and afterwards our buildings shape us. And this happens all over life, right? We shape the system and then the system starts shaping us. Sometimes with intentional practices, like in basketball, but sometimes unintentional practices. So, you put all the young families downstairs at PCPC, and they figure out ways to get into the church and drop their kids off and sneak up to the sanctuary as quickly as possible. So what ends up happening is that the young families at PCPC don't interact with anybody who's older than them, right? And it's because of the shape of the building, right? So, and start seeing this, whether it's in basketball or Amazon or Netflix or your job, and the buildings that we enter into, right? Again, formal and informal institutions, not necessarily physical structures, begin to shape us. And so one question we've got to ask is, how do we shape our buildings, right? Like, what's the process behind this? What's the process that allows us to shape buildings? And for that, if you've got a Bible, you can turn to Psalm 115. I'm going to hold it up here, but we'll just look at the first 8 verses of it. So I think this will be integral to the whole conversation. Right, so how do we shape buildings? So Psalm 115 begins this way: not to us, O Lord, not to us, but to your name give the glory, for the sake of your steadfast love and your faithfulness. Why should the nations say, where's their God? So here, the psalmist is really crying out and going to compare the true and living God with the God of other nations, right? Our God is in the heavens. He does all that he pleases. And then in verse 4, he starts talking about their idols. Their idols are silver and gold, the work of human hands. They have mouths but do not speak, eyes but do not see. They have ears but do not hear, noses but do not smell. They have hands but do not feel, feet but do not walk, and they do not make a sound in their throat. And verse 8 is I think the key verse in this whole exploration. Those who make them become like them. So do all who trust in them. Right, do you see it? Right, you make an idol and you will become like that idol. Okay, let me give an example from scripture. This is the Egyptian god of Hathor, right? You can go to the Egyptian Museum in Luxor and see this Egyptian god, right? In Exodus 32, when Moses is in God's presence, God tells Moses to go down for your people whom you brought out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded them and have made for themselves a golden calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And then this is how the Lord actually describes these people. It says, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Okay. See, their idols are silver and gold, the work of human hands. They have eyes but do not see, right? Ears but do not hear, noses but do not smell. They have hands but do not feel, and feet that do not walk, and they do not make a sound in their throat. See, what was happening is that the Israelites were becoming stiff like the calf, right? Maybe the stiffest necked of all animals. So the principle that comes out of this is that we become what we worship. Right? The process of becoming is really a process of worshiping, right? And it works both ways. right? You can become like the idol if you worship that thing, but likewise, you can become like Jesus if you worship him. Right? And you've probably all experienced this, right? Have you ever met someone or have a friend that over time you're like, he's becoming or she looks more and more like Jesus every time I meet with them? Right? And you're seeing it happen. And the reason it's happening is because they're worshiping the true and living God, and this is the process of formation. But you've probably also seen something else in other friends, right? That they start looking like the things they worship. Maybe it's money, and the way they carry themselves and what they talk about and the way they dress and what's consuming their thoughts and their actions and their minds is money, or potentially beauty, or maybe it's power, right? And we get consumed by these things, and they actually take over our hearts and minds, and they shape us into being a kind of person. They shape us to be the kind of person that's successful, right, in the story, in the systems that we've attached our lives to. Thus, now this is kind of the interesting part for those of us who are intrigued by culture and things, is that if you want to understand where a culture is headed, what you need to do is you need to find out what the culture is worshiping. Okay? Because we're image bearers, and as image bearers, we're designed to reflect, right, what we're worshiping. And how we do this is we reflect it onto the rest of creation by what we build and create and make and engage in. So as Fickert says in Becoming Whole, right, whatever we love most is what we worship. And as we are transformed into the image of whatever God we worship, then what we do is we create culture in our own image. Right? So what ends up mattering to us most, right? So this happens in churches, right? You know, some churches worship doctrine. And so what do they offer to people over and over and over again is class, information. Right? Other churches worship, and these are not necessarily like bad things, right? You know, false worship is not necessarily like a terrible thing. It's just something you place in the position of God. Some churches might worship service, right? And they ignore doctrine altogether, and it's just do. Others, it might be community and relationships, right? And the challenge is what we've got to be worshiping is God himself. And these false stories of change, right? These false stories will be hurtful and harmful to us as humans. And so there's two that we're going to look at in the next few minutes. So I'm going to blitz through them, and if we want to talk more about it, we can.
Hey, Blake, speaking of, before you start with those two things, there are these two little creatures that were made in your image and likeness. I don't know if you see them on your screen, but they are the sweetest little things that wanted to join. So I just wanted you to know that you have a sweet little cheerleading squad.
Oh, fun.
Yeah. So anyway, just before you went any further with image and likeness, and yeah.
I can hear them even though they're on mute. If that lets you know anything. They wanted to watch the baptism of the kids, which is why they're late. All right. So some false stories of change, right? So the first one is the false stories of change that dominates Western culture, and it's called naturalism. And what it does is it takes this mind, affections, will, body, relational being, and it reduces us to merely a body, right? And so, you know, the solution to psychological problems is, you know, in challenges is often always physical, right? Or chemical, if the case may be, right? Because we've reduced ourselves to merely being a body. Now, that doesn't mean that a body is not part of us. These chemical things are real, and they're real challenges. But it reduces the human being down. And so the process of formation in this Western naturalism looks something like this, or what's described as Homo economicus in sort of econ textbooks, right? So we're these consuming robots. And our story of change is that happiness is achieved through more consumption, and the only way you get more consumption is through growth. So you've got to figure out how to help these bodies consume more. And we create systems around this for growth and consumption, right? Our education system favors science and technology over the arts because science and technology allows for growth and the arts don't. And we create systems for consumption to where you can get things delivered to your house in 2 hours, right? And the practices that we have to engage in to be successful in Western naturalism are, you got to get a good education, which usually means certain degrees at certain schools. You get there through hard work, and then you start getting into this system of consumption, and you consume and consume and consume and consume. And we put ourselves through these practices, and they shape us and they change us. The problem is that it doesn't work, right? So this is a graph of depression among college students, and shows that it has been on the rise since World War II. During the era of the most unprecedented economic growth, the most unprecedented growth in consumption in human history. And what's happened, right, is that this false story of change of naturalism hurts. And it actually creates psychological problems because it ignores the fact that we are mind, affection, will, body relational beings, right? It's a story that's designed for beings that don't exist, right? And it's no wonder that this is troubling for us. Okay, so that's false story of change 1. There's a second false story of change, and it's a false story of change that dominates inside the church. All right, and this one can be called evangelical Gnosticism. So again, you've got this mind, affections, will, relational being. And what evangelical Gnosticism does is it reduces this mind, affections, will, relational being into an embodied soul, but that soul is really just a mind. And so what matters for the soul is assent to certain theological truths. You believe the right things about the gospel, and you're good, right? And at death, what we see happening with this mind, affection, will, body thing, or sorry, this mind, body thing, is that the mind and the soul sort of leave the body and go to be with the Lord, and the body just goes into the ground, right? And so we get on this new system of evangelical Gnosticism in the church of, we got to get souls saved. How do we get souls saved? Through trips, trainings, events, and classes. And kind of the primary practice is evangelism through persuasion and lots of Bible study. But it actually looks more like this because it ignores the body. And so all you have is this mind. And so Gnosticism, right, only speaks to part of who we are created to be. Therefore, once saved, what most people do is revert to our culture's story of change, right? So on Sundays and holidays, and maybe before work in the morning, we operate like this, right? And then on Monday through Saturday, we operate like this, like the rest of the world. And it ends up looking like, you know, if I was to summarize it, I would say this is the way we operate. We want to get the soul saved by believing certain truths. And then we want to live our best life now by living like the rest of the world, right? So what this does is it leaves us incredibly dissatisfied, right? And confused, because it ignores who we were created to be. It doesn't understand the importance of relationships, let alone how to deal with affections and the will. It ignores the fact that we're these highly integrated beings who are called by God to serve as priest kings. And so as Becoming Whole kind of comes to a close, this is what he says. He says, people experience human flourishing, right? This is not depression, right? People experience human flourishing when they serve as priest kings, using their mind, that should be mind, not mid, mind, affections, will, and body to enjoy loving relationships with God, self, others, and the rest of creation. And so as we move into our groups, there are a couple of questions I want you all to talk about, right? The first is, what false stories of change do you tend to believe? Right? In what ways does your life tend towards naturalism? In what ways does your life tend towards Gnosticism? And then ask questions about the true story about who you are and what you are created for. And then I think a helpful diagnostic in this is the last question, right? Instead of what would Jesus do, it might be helpful to ask, what am I doing, right? What am I doing in buying this car? What am I doing in downloading this TV show? What am I doing in accepting this job, and why? Right? Why did I want to watch that movie last night? What was calling me into that? And I think that will actually drive you into understanding what's going on behind these things. So we'll stop share. I see there's a couple of things typed. Cool. So any